Hello, viewers, and welcome to the very first episode of Tacklebox Talk. I'm your host, Adam Martin, from the Australian Recreational Fishing Foundation, the national peak body for rec fishing. So, what's Tacklebox Talk? Well, it's a show that we bring the community with us along to discover and educate them about the deeper and more meaningful things that are impacting our favourite activity, rec fishing. Some of these things are more complex and hard to wrap your head around, and that's why we have a Q&A, so you begin to understand what they mean. And then other things that we're going to speak about over the next year will be the things that ring true with you because you can relate to them. And we are doing all this for a reason, that as a community we can then start to lead the narrative and take rec fishing where we would like it to be as a gold standard. So how about we get on with the show and meet our guest? Hi, Frank. I would like to introduce everyone to Frank Prokop. He's well known throughout the rec fishing community in Australia. Frank, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and your history and experience?
I've spent a lot of time in very different places, Adam. I was a researcher working on endangered species for a time, a ranger with national parks, Australia's very first recreational fisheries manager in New South Wales, and then I went to Western Australia. And I was the executive director of RecFish West for 14 years and twice president of the forerunner of ARF, the National RecFish Australia peak body. I've also written a host of books and developed a fair few techniques using lures and jigs for trout.
Sounds like you've had a very diverse life and a lot of it in rec fishing. So what's the subject that you're going to communicate to us today?
We're going to try and talk about a very different approach to recreational fisheries management based upon the experience and the value of the experience. So rather than trying to maximize the catch or to optimize the catch, to quantify the catch, we're going to be talking about the drivers for recreational fishing for the experience, tapping into the improving community attitudes towards sustainability, and moving from a penalties-based management system to a rewards-based system.
Sounds really interesting, and I hope it leads to something where we can see improved fishing outcome. Well, why don't we jump to it, and we'll jump into the presentation.
Thank you, Adam. So the topic is called maximum experiential yield, and it's called MXY. So people would be familiar with MEY and MSY, maximum economic and maximum sustainable yield. This is about the experience, and it's about trying to work out ways that we can tailor our fisheries management to the needs of the recreational fishing sector. We have a long history of failing to understand what recreational fisheries are and what their drivers might be. We continue to smash a square peg in a round hole. And if we don't like how it's working, we end up with a pile of splinters, or we get a drill bit to try and make the hole bigger so that it will fit. It's important to realize that in spite of what you might think, we only manage people, not fish. You can manage the impact of people on the environment, but everything from a starfish to a southern bluefin tuna will spawn naturally in the absence of people. But if the people are catching them at the wrong time, that can greatly impact on the population. It's important that we stop the paternalism and the basis for compliance-driven management, where we assume that everyone is wanting to break the rules. There's no doubt that about 5% or so of recreational fishers are dedicated towards disobeying any rule, no matter how soundly based. But 95% of people will do the right thing. And it's time, rather than being driven by those people who do the wrong thing, to flip the whole chart and to get the people who want to do the right thing to be leading sound and sustainable management, because they're also the people who benefit the most. And this is probably the most technical term I'll use during this talk. We have to try and stop homogenizing a heterogeneous population. In other words, there is no such thing as a hypothetical average angler. The models will tell you that Frank Prokop will catch 1.1 trout, 0.7 bream, 3.2 flathead, and 8.6 whiting during the course of a year and spend $2,132. It then assumes that if they had Adam Martin standing next to me, he would be catching exactly the same thing. That is illogical and doesn't stand up to independent scrutiny. Even two people within the same boat have highly different motives and highly different skill levels in achieving what they're trying to do. Interestingly, most of the good fisheries management for recreational fishers has been well in front of biology. Things such as maximum size limits for Murray cod and barramundi, the slot limit for Australian bass to recognise the different sizes of the two sexes. So why is there so much opposition to the recreational sector driving change for their own benefit? And some of it gets back to history. At the moment, the latest buzzword are harvest strategies. And they're trying to develop strategies that enable the government to manage the stocks. But there's almost no attempt to try and understand what the drivers are for the recreational fishing sector. And there's no attempt to try and address all forms of mortality, including commercial bycatch and barotrauma. So the government's saying on one hand that the recreational fishers are catching fish from deep water and those fish are dying. But the commercials are fishing the same fish in the same area and apparently they're not having an impact. We have to recognize that the recreational sector can't claim massive benefits without recognizing there's an impact. And the government has to recognize that they can't just claim the impacts without also recognizing there's massive benefits. And tragically, the Commonwealth has been culpable in ignoring recreational fishing. Almost everything that's been done at the national level has been done through the intervention of politicians and without any support from the government agency that's supposed to be responsible. Here we have a classical graph that's shown to everyone about maximum sustainable yield. You don't need to go into it into too much detail other than to understand that it is a lump-shaped graph, and at the top you're trying to catch at maximum sustainable yield, and at the highest gradient, so the highest slope, you can get maximum experiential yield. Unfortunately, it's a two-dimensional representation of a four-dimensional problem, and it's crashed more fisheries than it's saved. Partly because with variable recruitment, the only time you can work out that you're at the right-hand side of the graph through fishing impacts and not through poor recruitment is by going so far past it that the recoveries are draconian and impact on commercial and recreational fishers to a huge extent. The two dimensions that are ignored are probably the two most important to recreational fishers, and that's time. In this case, what we have is a graph showing the Australian salmon catches on the south coast of Western Australia. We know that these stocks are largely driven by natural recruitment and that the fishing pressure mirrors the natural recruitment. So you can see some massive fluctuations over time. What we don't know is during those peaks, so recreational fishermen targeting salmon because they're popular, or are they targeting other fish because salmon are too easy to catch? Management requires that information to be able to be both responsive, proactive, and to provide benefit for the stakeholders they're supposed to be representing. And the other one is space. So a 40-centimetre bream that's caught in Sydney Harbour is much more highly valued than a 40-centimetre bream that's caught in the northern rivers, the Clarence or the Richmond, because there are a lot more fishers fishing in that area. There are significantly greater environmental impacts from humans, and we place different values on those fish. So the one in the bottom, which is blue spot emperor, a fairly common fish here in Western Australia, shows that effectively all the fish are taken from a very small population centre in the Pilbara. Yet we continue to have models that assume constant fishing pressure across the entire geographical area. This has to change. Here's perhaps the most important graph and the one that's most difficult to find. What it shows, and this is for snapper in New Zealand some time ago, but snapper in New Zealand are pretty easy to catch. What it shows that nearly 50% of people, even in this very good fishery, are catching nothing or keeping nothing. There are two very clear groups within this, populations within this graph. The ones on the left side are what I call experience or economic fishers. They don't keep very much, but they spend a lot of money. They're out there to sit either on the edge of a bank with their kids having a picnic, or ironically, they're the best anglers, and I'll come to that in a moment. On the right-hand side, you have what I call expectation or biological fishers. These are the ones who are taking reasonable numbers of fish and for whom traditional management are the only ones that there's ever been a target. It's very difficult to have a bag limit that affects someone who's catching 0 or someone who's catching 20 fish and letting them all go. And in reality, management traditionally has only affected the very far people on the far right-hand side. So in this case, the people who've caught 10 or more. That's less than 1% of the total catch. And although the number of fish may be significantly higher, as high as 15 to 20%, so there's some benefit pushing those fish from the right-hand side of the graph back to the left-hand side of the graph, those are the only people that we traditionally manage. I'm saying if we release the brakes and say to the community, what do you want to get out of your fishery, we'll get a very different answer. And ironically, many recreational fishers start at the left-hand side, get better, and then start to release more fish and increase their sport. Those people are not picked up in traditional catch per unit effort models. And here's something that you would think is painfully obvious. How much more valuable do you think that the fish on the left would be to a recreational fisher? And we don't ever incorporate that into our management thinking or management modeling. And if you say to most recreational fishers, and it doesn't matter whether it's a brown trout in this case, or a barramundi, or a flathead, or a Murray cod, if you say, would you like to catch a very large fish? The answer is almost certainly yes. And if you say that in order to catch very large fish, we have to have lots more medium-sized fish and heaps more small fish, are you willing to forego some of those fish to increase your chances of catching a really large one? I'm very firmly of the belief the answer will be almost always yes, as long as there isn't a lack of mechanisms to ensure that it's not a total reallocation from the recreational sector back to other users. And that means having objective and clearly defined outcomes as part of your management strategies, something which harvest strategies are saying they're doing, but aren't in reality. It's important that management recognizes that recreational fishing is a social experience. Maximum economic yield is not relevant where the activity does not occur in a commodity market. In other words, things like recreational abalone fishing in Western Australia behaves really closely to a commodity market. People go out to catch their bag limit of abalone and go home and cook them. But in almost all other instances, that's significantly less important than the secondary activities that go along that. And the traditional relationship between catch and effort rarely holds true. So in the case of New Zealand, in the picture that you saw before, I'm catching one brown trout above 25 centimeters about every 37 minutes. But I'm keeping one every 15 hours and 19 minutes. And most of the models only include the second one. And economic activity tries to only value the second fish. But if I'm catching all of them and letting them go, how can I value a second fish when I'm already letting them all go? Maximum sustainable yield is not relevant, as a stock at theoretical MSY may not yield an appropriate experience, such as the not enough trophy fish. So most of the commercial fisheries in particular are trying to catch medium-sized fish where they're more economically formed into schools and groups and are able to be harvested. But the recreational sector wants the ones that are what we would call escapees, because those are the ones that have that experience that provides you with the stories that we all like to tell. And when there are highly skewed catch distributions with high return rates by avid anglers, it's nonsensical to continue to use what they call normal distribution statistics to analyze something where the distribution is not normal at all. As you saw from the previous graph, the very best anglers are often keeping no fish and not being appropriately accounted for in both management strategies and economic activity. And different recreational fishers seek different types of experiences, ranging from mum and dad and their little toddler while having a picnic, up to the person who's willing to go to New Zealand to try and catch a trout, brown trout of the proportions I presented earlier. What we need are new goal-oriented and rewards-based approaches to develop adaptive and cost-effective management frameworks. In other words, we can't just have the most dedicated out there recreational fisher setting the agenda, but ideally we can't have the compliance people talking about the person who's a true criminal either. And that's been much more the norm. So we need to be at the top 25 to 30 percentile of recreational fishers and their progressive attitudes, and work out ways that we can deliver outcomes that optimize the experience for the majority of people while ensuring that there's conservative and sustainable fisheries. And I believe that's entirely possible by valuing the experience. It's sad that in management, insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result. And I've seen over the course of my career many attempts to do exactly the same thing with recreational fisheries management, and it's failed pathetically. Some of the best examples of successes are things like trout, where the biology isn't the driver at all. It's partitioning by time, space, and method the things that lead to the greatest experience across the community, and providing a variety of products that meet those needs. The efficiency assumption that everyone's trying to catch the most fish or kill the most fish is genuinely stupid. The community often leads by wanting, such as the film If People Came In Early, of those spawning pink snapper and Coburn Sound, to be protected, to ensure that we don't have to take every fish to crash the fishery in order to understand how badly management has failed. And we need to reward low-risk strategies with more big fish. Ideally, we want a fishery where there's a reasonable number of encounters or strike rates, which we've used with game fishing in the past, but the possibility that you're going to take a trophy-sized fish to make the experience truly noteworthy. We need to invest in people that will drive those changes and have them have an understanding of what the drivers are for groups like commercial fishers and conservation sectors. The key words are trust and respect. And at the moment, with the largely paternalistic management strategies that we have in place in Australia, that trust and respect is very low. Thank you for your time.
Well, Frank, that was a very informative presentation, and it takes a little bit to wrap your head around. But a special international speaker comes to mind, something that he says regularly in a lot of his talks, and that is, we keep doing the same thing, we'll keep getting the same result. But if we do something different and we do it in such a way that we are certain to get a good result, then we shall. And eventually mud stick once you keep throwing it against the wall. And so if we, I think with the presentation you offered, we might be able to change the way we manage our fisheries from a rec fishing point of view and get that gold standard fishing experience that we've been always looking for. And looking at New Zealand is a great example with a lot of the fisheries have. So why don't we head over to the Q&A section, because we've had a few questions put on the comments, and I've had a few text messages as well. Well, Frank, we've got a question from Nashi, and I think he's from South Australia. He writes, how can maximum experiential yield be used to improve the Australian snapper situation?
Well, snapper are easily the most difficult species to manage because commercial and recreational fishers want them. And in places like South Australia and Western Australia, their spawning success is highly variable. But maximum experiential yield will mean that both the recreational and commercial sectors will be trying to limit their take during those periods of good recruitment. So rather than what they call fishing the peaks, we'll be trying to push it out. In the case of the recreational sector, they'll be saying it's so much better to have a 30-pound or 15-kilo pink snapper than it is to have a 5-pound one or a 2-kilo fish. And for the commercial fishers, they can trade off certainty for catches into the future against biological risk. And at the moment in South Australia, they're really going through difficult times because they have overfished some of those recruitment peaks, and because the government had said, well, let's find out what's happening and what it will mean. But if you go to the recreational sector and you say, we're going to have some separation in time and space, we're going to treat those particularly large fish as largely recreational fish, because that's where the greatest value comes, the community value and the community dividend comes in those fish. And we're going to be managing so that their eggs are able to be contributed at some time in the future. So in the case of snapper in South Australia and Western Australia, rather than having this idea that fish have to breed once, we start to move towards an idea where they have to be able to breed successfully once. And that means a much more conservative approach to management. And again, the beneficiary, and if you were in New South Wales, you can only look at those giant fish with extreme envy, because in my opinion, the size limits are very poor in the eastern states. If you are more conservative with your catching of juveniles, there are going to be more adults. It's just common sense. And if the recreational sector believes that they get reward from that conservative approach, they're more likely to be participants.
Thanks, Frank. I've got a text message here from Max, and he's asking, how can MXY and the Murray-Darling Basin work together?
Well, I think that it's important to point out that things like Murray cod have recovered. And in fact, trout cod and eastern freshwater cod are probably the two best species recovery programs in Australia, if not the world. But Murray cod have recovered in the spite of some appalling management by the water resources managers. So even though we've had atrocious water management, the fishing for Murray cod in the rivers and in the impoundments has improved dramatically. What we're starting to see is that the maximum experiential yield extends further to include non-fishing related activities. So things like groups like Ozfish, for example, that are going in and putting snags in and getting out on the river are doing enormous things to benefit not just their fishing, but the fish upon which it depends. What we need to start to do is to get some recognition that those are the people who are actually in there fighting the good fight to protect the stocks and start to get those rewards. We are seeing it to a certain extent on things like Murray cod. We've a long way to go on species like silver perch, macquarie perch, and catfish throughout that catchment. But as we recognize the value of a single silver perch now in the upper Darling River, we can start to manage and have strategies that recognize the links between habitat and fish. And we start to get advocates from the leading recreational fishers for a more conservative approach towards our management. And they can work with the progressive members of the farming community because their goals align.
Thanks, Frank. We've got one from Jim. He asks, are there any states that are managing their fisheries well in regards to the aspects of what we've been discussing tonight?
We're starting to see some progress in places like the Northern Territory with their barramundi. I think there's been considerable progress in impoundments where there's no commercial fisheries. The snapper closures in Coburn Sound, notwithstanding that the government wants to try and destroy it with a poorly conceived port, have also been driven largely by the recreational fishing sector. So we're starting to see the very first vestiges of this appearing. And I think too, some of the things in Victoria, so one of the aspects of their Towards 1 Million is also to be saying that we need to provide an experience for the people who are entering the fishery, which is extremely important. It's not just all about the most avids. But I really think there's extreme opportunity. And if we can rejig, for example, the harvest strategies to be inclusive, broad, and not discriminating against recreational fishers, but including them, I think there's some opportunity for many places. I'll give you a very good example at the moment is kingfish in New South Wales, where that recreational fishery for kingfish in New South Wales is probably worth more than almost all the commercial fisheries in that state. Yet it hasn't even made the management radar. And why? Because of history. Because you need to have a different mindset into how you're going to manage yellowtail kingfish to provide the optimum community return in the long term based upon biology and angler needs. So if right now I was in New South Wales, I'd be saying we need to have a management committee to develop strategies to manage kingfish, not dissimilarly to what we did on Australian bass in 1991, when we brought in the first closed seasons and the first slot limits and bag limit components. It's time that we started to put the old things into the bin where they belong and started to get some new and progressive thinking.
That's a great one, Frank. I've got one more question from Benita Brown. She asks, how can the Aussie angler help drive fisheries management in a way that acknowledges rec fisho's intimate understanding of their local fishery?
There are a number of things that they can do, including further study. There are a number of leadership programs that are run by the Fisheries Research and Development Corporation. But I think one of the most fundamental things that we can do is stop asking what government needs to do for recreational fishing and start asking what we can do for fishing itself. So I've got an idea which I call Fine Five for Fishing, which says that every person, every recreational fisher should give 5 hours back to the promotion of their activity. And it doesn't matter whether it's putting snags in, scrubbing logs as they're doing in the Swan River, collecting seagrass pods, or putting walking tracks for the disabled to get to popular fishing places. It's time we all gave a little bit back to fishing. And when you start to get the massive numbers of participants times a very small number of hours, we can literally move mountains. And then out of that, we'll provide pathways for those people who have a greater interest to be able to move up the management ladder, so to speak, and to become the leaders that will then be developing yellowtail kingfish, Samson fish, King George whiting, as well as trout and native fish management strategies.
Thanks, Frank. You mentioned there the five for fishing. So 5 hours. And if we were to take the estimate of roughly 4 million rec fishers in Australia, if they all performed 5 hours of voluntary service, that's 20 million hours a year. 20 million hours is a lot of time that we could spend doing things that help out rec.
But what we also do need, Adam, to get us to government to recognise that it's actually help, that they don't put in place a whole bunch of bureaucratic impediments to make sure that they follow the government's agenda and not just the recreational fishers' agenda. So we're finding, for example, that it's next to impossible to put snags back in the Swan River because government departments are fighting common sense for reasons that are basically indefensible. So if you've got your 20 million hours, what we need is a receptive government or receptive politicians to develop projects that enable us to maximize those returns. And it's not just about recreational fishers, it's the whole community that will benefit.
Exactly. The productivity across the board when we improve the environment. Frank, we're running out of time, so I'll wrap us up and we'll head over to the wrap-ups. Well, thanks, Frank, for your time. I've really enjoyed listening to your presentation and the responses to the questions come from our viewers. Is there any final words you would like to give us before we finish up?
Remember that recreational fishing isn't just about catching fish. It's about spending time with your friends and loved ones. And the more that we have an understanding that it's broader than all that, the more that it benefits the entire community, and the more that we're willing to give a little bit to get something back, then we can start to develop clever strategies that will mean that we won't have to be fighting over the last fish. What we'll be doing is trying to manage the best fishing we've ever had.
Thanks, Frank. That's a great way to finish up. For everyone that didn't get their questions answered or would like to ask Frank more questions, you can leave more comments on this video once it's finished. Otherwise, you can send us an email at ARF, and that is info@arff.net.au, and we'll pass them on to Frank for him to answer for you. Our next episode is booked to be in the 30th of December this month on a Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Savings Time. And that's going to be by Dr. Owen Lee from Wollongong University. He's a social scientist. He looks at the social values of rec fishing, and his presentation's about Wreck Fishing in the 21st Century, a picture of diversity. I've seen part of his presentation. Really good. It touches the hearts of everyone. So I hope everyone has a safe and enjoys a festive period over the next week or so, and don't do too much wrong with the authorities, and get some fishing in. And for now, we'll make sure we see you on the 30th at 7 p.m. and we'll speak with Owen as well. Thanks, everyone, and good night.